The Roman Empire was one of the most efficient empires, not only about fighting and winning wars, but also controlling and developing its conquered regions. During most of its time, the Roman Empire was able to focus on a better domestic development. Cities were not subject to wars or invasion, and provinces were free to prosper, produce, and thrive, which most provinces did. The Romans also developed very good infrastructure. Roads and the Mediterranean seaports connected the Roman Empire, enhancing trade, commerce, learning, communication, and governance. Water viaducts, bridges, trade centers, and docks all made life easier and more enjoyable for the people. Roman laws were uniform throughout the empire, providing predictability and facilitating commerce. The Latin language tied the empire together and made communication and learning easier across the empire. Due to the mix of local people with Roman settlers, 5 Latin languages were born: French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian. The Greek language was used often in the Eastern Roman Empire and served the same purpose. Thanks to the Roman Empire, Europe developed its basic institutions that would be very important for its future. In the late years of the Roman Empire, life was not easier anymore. Massive corruption took over the money to maintain the cities, infrastructure, and the army, and combined with overcrowded cities, made life in camp fields and farms more attractive and safer in exchange of some local security. As a consequence, people living outside the cities started to use barter trade, decreasing the Roman currency throughout the empire, making it even harder to maintain its expensive army to protect its border against barbarian invasions. With the bad situation, people started to doubt about their current religion as well. That helped a new religion to spread, the Christianism. That was the beginning of Middle Ages. After the fall of Western Roman Empire, Europe was divided into barbarian kingdoms. Churches and noble families in the feudal system became very powerful and important. Serfdom was introduced, making peasants basically slaves, paying very high taxes to the nobles and the Catholic Church. It was a highly extractive system. It was a period of stagnation, but with time, mercantilism and the Roman Greek ideals was slowly getting stronger again in Western Europe, but nothing really significant. The Black Death came and hit Europe hard, killing around half of its population. The massive scarcity of labor created by the plague shook the foundation of feudal order. It encouraged peasants to demand things to change. At Ancient Abbey in England, for example, the peasants demanded that many of the fines and unpaid labor be reduced. They got what they wanted. What happened at Asia happened in most of Western Europe. Peasants started to free themselves from compulsory labor service and many obligations to their lords. Wages started to rise. The government tried to put a stop to this in 1351, passed the Statute of Labourers. This statute, in effect, tried to fix wages at the levels paid before the Black Death. This attempt by the English state did not work. In 1381, the peasants' revolt broke out, and the rebels, under the leadership of Wat Tyler, even captured most of London. Though they were defeated in the end, and Tyler was executed, there were no more attempts to enforce the Statute of Labourers. Feudal labor services dwindled away. An inclusive labor market began to emerge in England, and wages rose. Even though the plague in Western Europe seems to have the same effect in Eastern Europe, a more powerful, contradictory logic was at work. The massive scarcity of labor gave the lords a greater incentive to keep the labor market extractive and the peasants servile. In Western Europe, this motivation had been in play too, as reflected in Statute of Labourers. But workers had sufficient power that they got their way. Not so in Eastern Europe. After the plague, Eastern landlords started to take over large tracts of land and expand their holdings, which were already larger than those in Western Europe. Towns were weaker and less populous, and rather than become freer, workers began to see their already existing freedoms encroached on. It was also called the Second Serfdom, distinct and more intense than its original form of the early Middle Ages. Serfs subject to these rules made up 90% of the rural population by this time. Though in 1346 there were few differences between Western and Eastern Europe in terms of political and economic institutions, by 1600 they were worlds apart. In the West, workers were free of feudal dues, fines and regulations, and were becoming a key part of a booming market economy. In the East, they were also involved in such economy, but as coerced serfs grew in the food and the agricultural goods demanded in the West. This difference between West and East became very consequential for the lives of their populations and for the future path of institutional development. England was unique among nations when it made the breakthrough to sustained economic growth in the 17th century. Major economic changes were preceded by a political revolution that brought a distinct set of economic and political institutions, much more inclusive than those of any previous society. The success of the Glorious Revolution brought a limited power of the king and executive, and relocated to Parliament the power to determine economic institutions. At the same time, it opened up the political system to a broad cross-section of society, who were able to exert considerable influence over the way the state functioned. The Glorious Revolution was the foundation for creating a pluralistic society. The government also adopted a set of economic institutions that provided incentives for investment, trade, and innovation. It steadfastly enforced property rights, including patents granting property rights for ideas, thereby providing a major stimulus to innovation. It protected law and order. The English state aggressively promoted mercantile activities and worked to promote domestic industry, not only by removing barriers to the expansion of industrial activity, but also by lending the full power of the English navy to defend mercantile interests. By rationalizing property rights, it facilitated the construction of infrastructure, particularly roads, canals, and later railways, that would prove to be crucial for the industry growth. These foundations decisively changed incentives for people, and impelled the engines of prosperity, paving the way for the Industrial Revolution. First and foremost, the Industrial Revolution depended on major technological advances exploiting the knowledge base that accumulated in Europe during the past centuries. It was a radical break from the past, made possible by scientific inquiry and the talents of a number of unique individuals. The full force of this revolution came from the market that created profitable opportunities for technologies to be developed and applied. It was the inclusive nature of markets that allowed people to allocate their talents to the right lines of business. It also relied on high education and skills, at least by the standards of time, that enabled the emergence of entrepreneurs with the vision to employ new technologies for their business and to find workers with the skills to use them. Western Europe, experiencing many of the same historical processes, had institutions similar to England at the time of the Industrial Revolution. There were small but consequential differences between England and the rest, which is why the Industrial Revolution happened in England and not in France. This revolution then created an entirely new situation and considerably different sets of challenges to European regimes, which in turn spawned a new set of conflicts culminating in the French Revolution. The French Revolution was another critical juncture that led institutions of Western Europe to converge with those of England, while Eastern Europe diverged further. When the French revolutionary armies and then Napoleon invaded large parts of continental Europe, and in almost all the areas they invaded, the existing institutions were remnants of medieval times, empowering kings, princes, and nobility, and restricting trade both in cities and countryside. The leaders of the French Revolution, and subsequently Napoleon, exported the revolution to these lands, destroying absolutism, ending feudal land relations, abolishing guilds, and imposing equality before the law. What was started by the French revolutionary armies was continued in one form or another by Napoleon. Napoleon was first and foremost interested in establishing firm control over the territories he conquered. This sometimes involved cutting deals with local elites or putting his family and associates in charge, as during his brief control of Spain and Poland. But Napoleon also had a genuine desire to continue and deepen the reforms of the revolution. Most important, he codified the Roman law and the ideas of equality before the law into a legal system that became known as the Code Napoleon. Napoleon saw this code as his greatest legacy and wished to impose it in every territory he controlled. Of course, the French armies wrought much suffering in Europe, and the reforms imposed by the French Revolution and Napoleon were not irreversible. In some places, such as in Hanover, Germany, the old elites were reinstalled shortly after Napoleon's fall, and much of what the French achieved was lost for good. In other places, such as Poland and Spain, French hold was temporarily and limited, and as a result, revolution ideals were stagnant over there. But in many other places, the feudalism, the guilds, and the nobility were permanently destroyed or weakened. Even after the French left, in many cases, the Code Napoleon remained in effect. In 1800, Germany's social structure was poorly suited to any kind of social or industrial development. Domination by modernizing France during the era of the French Revolution produced important institutional reforms, including the abolition of feudal restriction on the sale of large landed estates, the reduction of the power of the guilds in the cities, and the introduction of a new, more efficient commercial law. Before 1850, Germany lagged behind the leaders in industrial development in the United Kingdom, France, and Belgium. However, the country had considerable assets, a highly skilled labor force, a good educational system, a strong work ethic, good standards of living, and a sound protectionist strategy based on the sovereign. By mid-century, the German states were catching up, and by 1900, Germany was a world leader in industrialization, along with Britain and the United States. However, traditionalism and absolutism remained strong in most of Germany. Without the changes in political institutions and political power similar to those that emerged in England after 1680, there was little chance for absolutist countries to benefit from the innovations and new technologies of the Industrial Revolution. In Spain, for example, the lack of secure property rights and the widespread economic decline meant that the people simply did not have the incentive to make the necessary investments and sacrifices. But in the East, Russia and Austria-Hungary, it wasn't only the lack of incentive to make investments, but also the rulers actively blocked any attempts to introduce these technologies and basic investments in infrastructure such as railroads that could have acted as their conduits. In Austria-Hungary, Opposition to innovation was manifested in two ways. First, Francis II was opposed to the development of industry. Industry led to factories, and factories would concentrate poor workers in cities, particularly in the capital city of Vienna. Those workers might then become supporters for opponents of absolutism. Francis' policies were aimed at locking into place the traditional elites and the political and economic status quo. He wanted to keep society primarily agrarian. The best way to do this, Francis believed, was to stop the factories being built in the first place. This he did directly, for instance, in 1802, banning the creation of new factories in Vienna. Instead of encouraging the importation and adoption of new machinery, the base of industrialization, he banned it until 1811. Second, he opposed the construction of railways, one of the key new technologies that came with the Industrial Revolution. When a plan to build a northern railway was put before Francis II, he replied, No, I will have nothing to do with it, lest the revolution might come into the country. His main priorities were ensuring the stability of the extractive institutions over which he ruled and protecting the advantages of the traditional elites who supported him. Not only was there little to gain from industrialization, which would undermine the feudal order by attracting labor from the countrysides to the cities, but Francis also recognized the threat that major economic changes would pose to his political power. As a consequence, he blocked industry and economic progress, locking in economic backwardness which manifested itself in many ways. Farther east, Russia had an equally absolutist set of political institutions forged by Peter the Great. Like Austria-Hungary, Russia's economic institutions were highly extractive, based on serfdom, keeping at least half of the population tied to the land. Serfs had to work for nothing 3 days a week on the lands of their lords. They could not move, they lacked the freedom of occupation, and they could be sold at will by their lord to another lord. The lords feared that if industries come to Russia, the rural flight would happen, meaning that serfs would have to leave the rural region to work in the factories, and as a consequence, the lords would lose their control of most of the agrarian population. Russia only changed its policy against railways when they were defeated by British, French, and Ottoman forces in the Crimean War, when the backwardness of its transportation network was understood to be a serious liability for Russian security. The Ottoman Empire conquered most what was the East Roman Empire and grand part of North Africa, and it lasted 600 years, more than enough to install its extractive economy in its territories. The Ottoman state was absolutist, with the Sultan accountable to few and showering power with none. The economic institutions the Ottomans imposed were highly extractive. There was no private property in land, which all formally belonged to the state. Commerce was under state control, and occupations were strictly regulated by guilds and monopolies. Taxation of land and agricultural output, together with loot from war, was the main source of government revenues. The Ottoman Empire did not dominate the Middle East in the same way that it could dominate its heartland in Anatolia. The Ottoman state was continuously challenged by tribal powers in the Arabian Peninsula. It lacked not only the ability to impose a stable order, but also the administrative capacity to collect taxes. The Balkans only got their independence in 1913. The region could not develop so much because it was already plagued by economic and social scars left by the Ottoman Empire, and combined with World War I, they were unable to develop almost nothing. The institutional dynamics we have described ultimately determined which European countries took advantage of the major opportunities present in the 19th century onward and which ones failed to do so. The rich countries of Europe today are those that embarked on the process of industrialization and technological change starting in the 19th century, and the poor ones are those that did not. It's not a surprise when the World War I broke out. An attrition warfare that highly demanded manpower, a good railway and industry system to transport and produce military equipment and supplies to sustain the war effort. The three empires that collapsed were those ones that were already stagnated economically because they did not industrialize and their institutions were highly extractive. The collapse of the Russian Empire brought the communism to Russia and later to Eastern Europe after World War II, starting another type of government system that restricted free market, free speech and controlled the industrial and agricultural production, and it would last until 1991 with the collapse of Soviet Union.